Great. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to the Youth Coalition for, very welcoming, warm introduction and for, allowing me to contribute to your community of practice sessions. I'm on Wurundjeri land here in Victoria. I was born, however, on Waduk Noongar land in what is now colonially known as the southwest of Western Australia. Here on the land that I am now, the Wurundjeri people have not ceded sovereignty to non-Aboriginal people like myself, which means that I'm an occupier, unfortunately, and that I need to recognise what things myself, my family, the communities that I belong to have unfortunately benefited from in occupation of First Nations lands, and that there is some undoing. There is some giving up of space, giving up of platforms, giving up of resources so that there can be a true sovereignty, a true space for First Nations people to regain sovereignty, to regain actual ownership, not only traditional ownership of their lands, their seas, country, spirit. And also, too, that journey of giving up, of course, as we know, is a journey of enrichment for all of us as well, too, that there's so much for us to learn about community, country, spirit, collective responsibility, coming back home to the land and realising our interconnectedness, which certainly my own white neoliberal culture has not equipped me very well in. So it's both a giving up and also an enrichment for us all, even though, of course, so many of our political leaders in this country don't unfortunately see it that way and are still hooked on the benefits of dispossession and exploitation. So for the Ngunnawal people that so many of you sit on and work on and live on and love on, all my respects to all Ngunnawal elders and warriors, past, present and emerging. Today, I will be flying through some content on how do we engage fathers and male caregivers in the context of youth and family-focused services. And I know that for many of you, you're working with young people who've experienced harm, some children and young people who might be also engaging in harm, whether that be towards a parent or a sibling, or maybe even in the context of their early intimate relationships. And of course, in so many of those situations, there is a male caregiver, a father, who is causing domestic, family and sexual violence harm. And that will be my focus, not so much on engaging young people who are causing harm, but more on a male caregiver, a father who is causing harm. My background, as Thomas explained, is in behaviour change work with men who cause harm. And I'm really passionate about training a wide range of workforces to step into this. Because we've all, of course, got different responsibilities, and many of you here are not behaviour change workers and won't have within your services or your roles to do long-term work with men and male caregivers who cause harm. But nevertheless, what we all do, how we can ladder these men up, how we can sow seeds, listen out for risk, have motivationally enhancing conversations, be aware of shame-sensitive practice, and find that balance, that really tricky balance between humanising someone who's causing harm, yet at the same time trying to promote real accountability. And that's a very difficult balance to hold. And I hope that today we will focus on a few practice concepts and a few skills that might be helpful with that. I'll be speeding through. There is so much terrain that we can cover, and a lot of what we'll be focusing on, we could easily spend a 1 day, 2 day or a 4 day workshop on. So you will see me speed through some things, but as Thomas mentioned, there's resources to come back to for you to do a deeper dive. And towards the end of our time together in this community of practice session, I will just briefly outline some of those resources so that when you look on the website you can actually locate which resources might be useful for your work. And I think the final thing before we get started that I'd really love to emphasise is obviously let's take care as you all participate. I find that when we have a lived experience, and we start to look at how does a father, male caregiver who causes harm, justify quite horrible, awful behaviour with such intense impacts on children and families, it can sometimes reverberate to maybe our own lived experience or the lived experience of people we care about in our personal lives and in our communities. It can sometimes touch upon some of that lived experience. And of course, lived experience can be an amazing teacher. Some of the most effective resources I've seen come from lived experience leaders who use their lived experience to try to help others to understand domestic, family, and sexual violence. So let's take care of ourselves as we go through this, and feel free to take a little bit of time after the hour and a half for a bit of reflection. Hopefully you don't need to speed on to your next client straight away. Also, as Thomas mentioned, if you've got questions along the way, put them in the Q&A function or the chat or however that works for these community practice sessions. We'll have a couple of opportunities for Thomas to pick out some of the questions and to pose them to me as well. So feel free to send them in at any point. I won't be looking at them as they go along, but Thomas will be, and there'll be an opportunity to present some so that I can respond to them at a couple of points. Okay. So firstly, I'm going to share screen and using some slides as some prompts, start to work through some key concepts and understanding around the men, the fathers, the male caregivers when they're using domestic, family and sexual violence, to understand where that behaviour comes from, to look at what it means around these fathers using choices to cause harm, and then what that means for specialist services to try to do the pointy end work, and then what might be our role when we may not be in a specialist service situation, but what's our role to try to ladder and support fathers and male caregivers to become closer towards the accountability journeys which might lessen the harm they're causing to family members. So let me share screen. And we will get started. I'd love to start talking about shame. This is an intense way to start, and it reminds us all of the self-care that's going to be very important during this session. There are many reasons why users of violence don't admit to their behaviour, why they minimise, deny their behaviour, blame others, blame their partner, blame their children, rather than take responsibility and be accountable for their behavioural choices and the harms that they cause. There are a number of reasons for this. For many fathers and male caregivers, one of the most potent reasons is shame. We experience shame when we feel bad. It's different from guilt. And guilt occurs when we engage in behaviour that has impacts on others and we feel bad about those impacts. We feel guilty about something when there's a bit of other-centeredness there, when there's a bit of acknowledgement that we've done something that means that it's inconvenienced someone in a major way or has caused them to feel something really bad or negative, or they've missed out on an opportunity or whatever. The feeling guilty is related a bit to those impacts, and ultimately with users of violence, we want to shift experiences of shame towards experience of guilt, because guilt has a bit of other-centeredness, a bit of awareness of impacts, and where the person recognises they don't want that other person to experience those impacts and they don't want to contribute to those impacts. Shame, however, is much more person-centred, and of course, for many of you who work with young people who experience harm or who are causing harm, I know you're dealing with shame all the time. Shame is experienced when we feel that there's something bad about ourselves. And it's self-centered rather than so much other-centered. For many of the fathers who cause harm, unfortunately, there's multiple levels of shame. Now, shame is not necessarily a totally horrible thing. For many who use violence, when we're trying to support journeys of accountability, there is uncomfortability in that journey. There's no way around that. If there's no discomfort, there's no change. And part of what we'll be looking at today is how do we invite male caregivers and fathers into journeys of discomfort that they can manage, that won't overwhelm them with shame, and where, if anything, there's a bit of feeling good about feeling bad. But for some of the men that you work with, there are so many multiple levels of shame, it becomes very difficult for them to experience any shame. And this pyramid is, there's a whole resource around this, which I'll talk about at the end, shows how for some users of violence, there are many sources of shame. And that can, of course, include their own experiences of complex trauma when they were young. Now, of course, not all fathers and male caregivers have complex trauma backgrounds. I've worked with a number who've had pretty good childhoods, who've had, low privilege levers in their lives. And really their violence is mostly about male entitlement, maybe misogyny as well. Really their violence is about exploiting, extracting benefits from family members. They don't really care that much about their children. They're not really that interested in intimacy with their partner. They're just there to exploit benefits. Yes, certainly there's some of those men and fathers. But there are a number who have experienced complex trauma as a child, where particularly for boys, some boys who experience their father using violence against themselves, their mum, their siblings, or who experience childhood sexual abuse. Some boys, as they grow a little older, into their teen years, really start to feel that if I was a real man, I would have stopped the abuse. And they start to feel there was something really wrong about themselves, that they weren't able to stop the abuse happening to them and maybe to their siblings. Now, they can also start to be influenced by misogynist forces to blame their mum for not stopping the abuse as well. So sometimes misogyny, or even if it's not misogyny, but not trusting women, sexist beliefs about women can in part be influenced by some boys' experiences of complex trauma if they start to feel that mum didn't protect me, and they become involved in peer associations which start to have some of those sexist, misogynist views. And of course, for many children, they don't understand the full impacts of their father's use of violence on their mum. They don't see the systems abuse. They don't see all the upstream planning he does to cursively control her. So when you're 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, the boy does not realise that mum's options are very limited. She might be too frightened to stand up to him, of course. So he can easily tend to blame her in part because he's not aware of how her options have been so limited by his cursive controlling behaviour, by the dad's cursive controlling behaviour. So they can develop a negative view of mum that can be generalised towards a negative view of women, but they also can feel masculinity threat. And they may not see it in this way when they're 5 or 6 or 7, but as they get older, they can have this underlying sense of, I'm not a real man, because if I was a real man, I would have been able to stop the abuse. And so that, plus other patriarchal forces in our society, and together too, if the boy, as he becomes an adolescent and becomes a young man, hasn't got the privilege levers that maybe some other men have to succeed in society. They may not be physically super strong. They may not have class privilege. They may not have able-bodied privilege. They may not have cisgendered privilege, etc., etc. They may not have white privilege. And as a result of that, the odds are stacked up against them to succeed in a traditionally masculinized way in our society. They're marginalised down the pecking order, but still they feel this pressure to measure up to be a man. And so what that can mean, because there's that underlying sense of shame there where they don't feel like they're men, or they don't feel like they're for men, they go on a mission to prove to themselves and to others that they're a real man. So when they start relationships and they have a partner who expresses her own viewpoint, or maybe wants some independence, he actually can start feeling really threatened, really jealous, because it's not like, oh, great, she's got her own views, she's got some independence, and she's got some different opinions to me. It's like, what, you're wronging me? You're telling me I'm wrong? You're telling me I'm not good enough, and that's why you're cheating on me, when, of course, she's probably not cheating on him, but he is so worried and so sensitive to feeling shame and humiliation that he can so easily start to develop that anxious anxiety about her cheating on him and almost start believing it's happening because that anxiety runs away. So he then starts to shut down her behaviour, because even if she just leads her own life and makes her own autonomous decisions, and he sees that as a threat to his masculinity, that she's standing up to him, which means that she is telling him that he's wrong and that he's not right. So there can be a real sensitivity where he interprets just a range of things that she is doing, just to be a normal part of life in a relationship, as a threat to him. Because underneath, he doesn't want to feel that shame. And that shame is, I'm bad, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable, I'm not a real man. And then, of course, the male entitlement comes in. Men can get away with, often in relationships, blaming women for their own bad feelings. It's part of that patriarchal society of women doing emotional labour work for men. So when he feels an intense feeling of shame, jealousy, anger, humiliation, he blames her for making him feel that way, rather than taking his own responsibility and healing work to understand that feeling doesn't come from what she's doing. It's coming from stuff that's happened from him in the past, and also coming from a thankless task of trying to prove to himself that he's a real man. So this means it's really tricky when we're engaging with the men, because when we're trying to invite them to take a look at what they've done, there's not just that bit of shame that happens when they realise that their behaviour is not who they are, when they realise that they're not the good dad that they'd like to be, maybe not the safe man that they'd like to be, when they start to look at how their behaviour contradicts their values or contradicts aspects of character that are important to them. That's a useful shame. Unfortunately, all the other layers of shame come in and they don't want to feel it, so they deny. No, I did not do that. Oh, she made me do it. They see themselves paradoxically as being the victim of their partner's behaviour or what else happens, because they don't want to experience the shame if they were to take responsibility, because it's overwhelming. So this does make this tricky, and this means that often with men who use violence, particularly if they've used violence for a long time, we need to go slowly. Now, when engaging with younger people who are causing harm, this hasn't built up quite as much. And that's why these early intervention opportunities are really important. But for fathers and male caregivers, they've had years and years of trying to protect themselves from the shame by blaming others and making it out that other people are wronging and harming them. So we call this a victim stance. And this victim stance is how he makes himself out to be the victim of his partner's unreasonable behaviour. It's like, you're making me jealous, you're making me angry, I just could not take it anymore. When often all that his partner or former partner is doing something quite reasonable, but he interprets it as a threat, as a challenge to him, and then he feels wronged. And by feeling wronged, he gives himself the green light to use violent and controlling behaviour, to monitor her social media feed because he believes she's cheating on him, or to use horrible emotional abuse to make her feel too unattractive to attract other men because he is so jealous, etc., etc. And the thing is about the fathers and the male caregivers is that when they're using intimidation or physical violence, emotional abuse, or texting her 100 times, belittling her, they often experience themselves as being powerless because they feel a very strong feeling, humiliation, anger, jealousy, whatever it is. And then they believe that, look, I just could not take it anymore from her, and they explode in their view. And of course, this can be children as well. It's a situation of a dad that comes home, 4-year-old child is playing with their toys, immersed, and the child doesn't look up to greet the dad. And rather than the dad going, oh, great, wonderful, they're having fun, fantastic, I won't disturb them, you might have a dad going, and excuse the language here, you little shit, you're not even recognising me as I come in. Because it's all self-centered, and it's about the child needing to acknowledge him and make him feel good about himself. And he just sees himself as exploding. Oh, yeah, I lost her, I criticise the child, I lost the child because, she just gets me so angry by not acknowledging me. She takes me for granted, which of course is very inappropriate for parents to think of their children. he doesn't realise he's working himself up. That he's actually very quickly in his head thinking a whole lot of things that makes him out to be the victim, and they're hostile thoughts. This is unfair. You know I'm a jealous guy. How dare you? But because he is not clued in to how quickly these thoughts happen, he just experiences the emotion, and then he, in his view, explodes, rather than realizing that he's actually working himself up in this way. So he feels righteous. The anger that he experiences, he feels he's right because, in his view, he's been wronged by someone else. And he uses his male entitlement to not care about the impacts on others and to actually deliberately create fear, deliberately create terror, or deliberately to wear his partner down over time, to raise the costs for her to do something that he doesn't want her to do. If she wants to wear something that he feels threatened by, he won't necessarily automatically create intense fear to stop her from wearing that. He might just wear her down, criticise her over and over again so that she gets to the point of going, I don't know if I'm going to continue to wear this because he's just going to give me so much shit for doing it. I'm just going to wear what he wants me to. So that's where the curse of control comes in. Now, for the male caregivers and fathers who use violence, it's always often about power and control. Their intent for doing that can differ, and we won't unpack the different intents and motivations. Some men, but just really briefly, some men are very dependent on their partner, can't live without her. And so will do whatever they can to control her and trap her because they're just so psychologically dependent on her, logistically dependent on her, and to be honest, would be somewhat or very suicidal if she was to separate. For others, it might not be that. For others, it might be, as I talked about before, they're really just wanting to extract benefits from her and the family. So the motives for using violence really differ. For another, it could be because they are coping with really complex trauma and are really using her to regulate himself. But invariably, we're talking obviously about curse of control that unfortunately he's invested in for quite a while. And this is why change is slow. It's not only about helping him to regulate particularly intense emotions so that he can slow those moments down when he does feel triggered, slow those moments down when he believes he's being wronged or harmed, and to be able to respond differently. Yes, that is important. And I know that in your work with young people, you do a lot of that emotional regulation work. But for male caregivers and fathers, they've invested in a whole series of behaviours, including upstream behaviours, to try to control her, to stop her from, in his belief, having affairs with others, or to make sure that she keeps doing domestic housework or provides him with sex. The curse of control around that, unfortunately, is constant over a number of years. And again, it might come back to controlling her so that she doesn't have a say, because for her to have a say means that he feels wronged. And if he feels wronged, he then feels he's less of a man and he cannot stand that humiliation and shame. So he chooses to control her, make her world small, and make her ability to have space small because he can't stand that feeling of him feeling wronged by her. So he will use cursor controlling behavior in a range of different ways to stop her from producing that feeling for him. It's totally unfair. It's regulating her, dominating her so that he feels okay about himself. The thing is, it's an investment. He does it for many years, and that's why it can be hard to shift. And of course, part of this, as we know, includes what he might do to harm her ability to parent or to sabotage her relationship with her children, or in LGBTIQA plus contexts, to sabotage the other parent or the other parents' connections with their children. And he may not be deliberately doing this. He might be. But at least often there's these impacts that harm on family functioning and the other parent's parenting capacity. So he does not see these behaviours as a choice. He sees himself, unfortunately, as just exploding. And this issue of choice is complex, and we won't unpack this now. This is one of the resources that you have later, but I'm just aware of time and we want to get to skills as quickly as we can. Of course, the dads differ. Yeah, there's some dads, if we look at leavers, who have lots of privileged leavers. They might hold responsible positions. They might even be police or solicitors, etc. And of course, we know that for those fathers and male caregivers who cause harm that have these privileged leavers, they might be leaders within their ethno-cultural community, that can be really tricky. And also, too, risk can be higher sometimes with men with these sort of privileged leavers because they've got a lot to lose. One of the things we'll focus on a bit later in listening out for risk is the person who's using violence starting to experience a sense of loss or a sense of identity loss due to the consequences of his use of violence. Systems come in, there might be intervention orders, there might be court conditions. As the system tries to reduce his opportunities to continue to cause harm, does he experience that as she, meaning his partner, former partner, has stripped away something from me, stripped away my right to see my kids, meant that I've lost my high-paying job, meant that I've lost faith in my community now because people think I'm a wife basher. So we think about what is he losing as a result of his use of violence and what might that mean for potentially increased risk. Many of the dads that you work with are making choices to use violence under situations where the choice is never excusable. At the same time, the choice is made easier, unfortunately, by AOD, mental health struggles, or maybe by the patriarchal world that they live in, or by online misogynist influences. Still doesn't excuse their behaviour. We always need fathers and male caregivers to choose non-violence, irrespective of how influenced they are by a substance, etc., etc. But if he struggles with jealousy and he's drinking alcohol or on ice, he's going to ruminate a lot more. We know that some dads, their capability of making safe choices is less than others. We still need them to make those safe choices, but there are things against them that do make it generally hard. And there are some dads that you work with where they've used violence in a range of situations, not only against a partner or former partner, but a lot of violence against other men who may have genuine difficulty in regulating emotions. So choice is complex. Won't continue to unpack this now. We can look at this in more detail through that resource I've talked about later. But I guess we're focusing here that you're often working with dads and male caregivers where there are these intersectional issues, where there are factors and forces and things that they're up against to try to be that safe man and that safe dad. And for some of these men, it can be mental health issues, anxiety issues, neurodiversity, where because of that, they're looking to try to control their environment. What happens, though, however, is that because of that male entitlement, they're not just trying to negotiate with their partner around things, they're demanding things. So, for example, men with a substance use issue don't just try to negotiate with their partner about what it means for them to maintain that AOD lifestyle. If they're using domestic, family and sexual violence, they'll just set rules. They'll just take money. They might just make her go out and do sex work to grab money for his habit. And it's not negotiated, it's just demanded, and that's where the entitlement comes in. I'm going to fly through this bit. I want to fast forward to a couple of things about behaviour change programs and your role, and then we'll get to our first Q&A quite soon. So I'm not going to spend time now unpacking how these various complex needs and intersectional factors combine with entitlement around his choices to use violence. But this is something that you can, come back to unpack through the slides or through the resources. Okay. So moving through AOD, mental health issues and how they are contributing factors and important for us to address. Let's look at your role and what does it mean to try to hold the user of violence accountable. And I think we're in a society where often if you were to ask premiers, chief ministers, or police commissioners, etc., what it means to hold the user of violence accountable. Often we think about consequences, criminal justice system responses, and intervention orders, imprisonment, etc. And we know that those mechanisms, while they can be important to create safety for victim survivors, breathing space, they might interrupt his opportunities or inclinations to use violence. So they can create breathing space, but we know that those, an important breathing space for survivors, but we know that those mechanisms themselves don't change behaviour. And of course, when we have a father or male caregiver who already feels very strongly in victim stance, she gets me jealous. She knows I'm an angry man, yet she keeps criticising me in front of the kids, etc., etc. When he's thought stacking and working himself up and making a case that he's been treated unfairly to give himself the green light to choose violent behaviour. And then the system comes along and take away what he sees as his rights to see his kids, or he can't live at home anymore, etc., etc. That victim stance just becomes even more intense. So we know that those justice system mechanisms, of course, aren't accountability processes in themselves. And of course, there are communities that are marginalised and oppressed by justice system responses. So accountability is a process. It's an invitation where it often requires a lot of responses by a range of responders and services to help him to gradually grow the space for him to be able to look at the harm that he's caused, but in particular, to focus on what does it mean to be the sort of man or father he really wants to be. It's really forward-focused. And of the many takeaways and skills we're going to cover as quickly as we can in this hour and a half, one of them is we don't always need a dad or a male caregiver to admit everything that he's done in order to start a process of accountability. Yes, if he ignores everything and says, I'm perfect, I didn't do a single thing, of course, that's not great. But for every little bit where we're trying to invite a father to focus on the harm that he's caused and the impacts on young people and children and his partner and his family, for every little bit we're doing that, we're doing a lot more forward-focused. Tell me, John, what does it mean for you to be the best dad that you can be? If we were to ask, your 16-year-old, Aaron, what would he say? What about your 9-year-old, Beck? What would she say? What would your partner say that she'd like you to do to be the best dad that you can be for your children? When you feel good about yourself as a dad, what are you doing? What do your children see? What does your family see? What things do you want to work harder towards in being that best dad? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of what do we want to move towards? And as we'll talk about a bit later, that's really important because we can then focus on values. So tell me, John, you're saying that you want your kids to feel relaxed around you. You want to be a fun dad. Can you tell me why is that really important for you? So we're trying to get at values. We're trying to get at what he wants to work towards and why that matters to him. The why is critical. It means behaviour change program work, the more pointy end. We sometimes run processes with the men, very self-confronting processes, so we do this very carefully, inviting them to write an eulogy for their funeral and say 30, 40, 50 years' time, and there's a funeral, and their children, their adult children, are actually reading out what they really admire, like gratitude about him. What would they say? What does he want? What would he want their children to say about him? So that sense of values, aspects of character, aspirations, and what he wants to move towards is really important because undoubtedly his behaviour is not doing that. His behaviour is moving away from that. So by investing time on the positives and what does healthy fathering look like, and what does it look like when you're that fun dad? What do you need to do so that your kids can feel relaxed and fun around you? And then, as we'll talk about later, we can springboard. What are some things that if you do might make it harder for you to be that fun dad? What are some things that your kids might experience from you that means that they're not going to feel fun around you? So we can get to the negatives, really important, but often we can start that off with the positives. So just a couple more slides and then we'll have our first Q&A opportunity. Obviously, there are the behaviour change programs that do well, I guess you could call it treatment. It's not the word that I would use. This is adapted from a Northern Hemisphere model. And that work is long and slow. And I'll talk a little bit about what behaviour change options we have in the ACT in a tick. But for many of us, our role when we're engaging fathers and male caregivers is going to be within that yellow car-shaped space. We're identifying violence. We're trying to motivate him to open up some plants and seeds. We're trying to find some ways in which him making some changes to his behaviour might matter to him and why that might help him to be the man, the person that he really wants to be. And then if he does start to admit a little bit about his behaviour, maybe a tip of the iceberg, and starts to talk about the dad that he wants to be or the calm dad that he thinks he is or whatever, then how do we then start to do a bit of work to motivate him to go to some services that will help him to do that? And then all along the way, we're always listening out for risk. I'm going to unpack a little bit towards the end today, and we may be able to do a bit of safety planning with him. Things that he might be able to do to interrupt some of his characteristic choices to use violent and controlling behaviour. But because we're not behaviour change programs, we can only start that off a little bit, but those seeds can really matter. And it's often the contributions of a lot of responders over time that help to ladder him up in that way. There's a number of places we don't want to refer a user of violence to because of time. I'm going to unpack this now. Well, we're looking at behaviour change programs, not just any old anger management course, because anger management courses don't get at the root of those investments and coercive control I talked about earlier. Those that don't listen out for risk, they don't necessarily share information, and they don't have parallel support to those who are experiencing his violence. So they operate in a bit of a vacuum, and often an unsafe vacuum, and don't necessarily get at the core underlying drivers. If you need to refer to private psychologists, do your homework. I was working with users of violence as part of a general casework counselling setting in the 1990s, and I didn't know what I was doing and I caused harm. So you're really looking for those practitioners who've got experience in behaviour change. We don't want to refer him to relationship counselling with his partner because he'll just blame her. And it's not a relationship issue, it's his behavioural choices. So for relationship counsellors or for family therapists, if they're working with a couple or the family system as a whole, it means that they're going to focus on the relationship as a cause of the harm or structural systemic family therapy issues as the cause of the harm when it's his behaviour. And because he's in victim stance, anything that he can do to blame his partner or other family members, he will. So this sort of type of services, unfortunately, just gives them an opportunity to blame others or to mutualise responsibility. And it also means the victim survivors will be very careful about what they can disclose in front of him and may not say the whole truth because they don't want to be retaliated against. So we're looking at behaviour change programs. They produce incremental change. The change processes differ from man to man. Some men change a lot, some men drop out, some men attempt to weaponise their participation in the program, family court. It really varies. But what the programs do, and we're looking obviously at Room for Change run by DVCS, and Everyman Australia often does individual case management, behaviour change work. Sometimes, occasionally, Relationships Australia, Canberra region also runs a behaviour change program, but not all the time. And I believe that Yedamura Aboriginal Corporation are starting a Caring Dads program, which is a parenting-focused behaviour change program for men who cause harm to their children, often in the context of domestic and family violence. These programs, they look out for risk. They offer parallel support to his partner or former partner. They will work within an integrated context and share information with other services. And they will invite the man into a series of change processes that help to create a non-humiliating space for him to sit in a space of discomfort, to be able to stretch his ability to deal with the shame that he experiences. so that he can start to bring more of his harmful behaviour gradually into view, understand the impacts, and not only work towards skills, but look at those ways he might need to see the world differently, or how he sees himself as a man differently, how he sees power differently, so that he can work towards standing with his family rather than standing over his family. So I'll just pause now and see, Thomas, if there's some questions in the chat that you might pose. I'll stop sharing now, and respond to any questions that might be around.
Yeah, I'll just give everyone a moment. Feel free to put any questions in the Q&A or the chat that you have. While you were presenting, I was just thinking about around like shame versus overwhelming them, and was wondering, like, is there sort of any warning signs? Is there, what's that balance look like?
Yeah, sure. And I think part of this is as we know, when shame is overwhelming, responses can include thus complete disengagement. In a one-on-one context, it can mean eye contact going. It could mean looking out the window. It could also mean increase the minimisation and denial as well too. It can mean, it can mean a number of, I guess, different things when we detect it. But I think for me, it's often when his minimisation, denial, other blaming increases. And just really briefly, because I know there's one or two questions coming in, shame can be an opportunity. So when, say, I've worked with a man and he denies doing something, I know he's done it, but I can't confront him with that because it would be unsafe. It may well be I know he's engaged in that really harmful behaviour because his partner has told our service, or maybe his partner's told police or whatever, and he's not aware of what she's disclosed. And so we can't just bring that in and say, well, of course you did it. A, that will humiliate him, but B, it might mean it's just really unsafe because he might then try to retaliate against his partner to stop her from disclosing things. So when that minimisation happens, I might respond, so John, so say that he's denied that he's assaulted his partner. So John, it sounds as though that hitting women is something that you don't really want to do. Could you tell me more about that? I'm trying to open up a space if he's denying something for him to give me words and reasons why that behaviour is wrong. Because if he's done it, he's denying it. We can ask him, so that, it sounds like the hitting women is wrong. Could you tell me about that? Trying to create an opportunity for him to talk about values or reasons why that behaviour is wrong, so that he's actually articulating a case against the behaviour that he's done. Underneath, I'm hoping he's feeling a bit uncomfortable at this moment because he knows he's done it. But at the same time, I'm hearing values. And so I can keep coming back to that often in the conversation later on. So John, you were saying earlier that hitting women is not who a real man is. Can we now talk about you spitting against your partner? I wonder how that sits with, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow. Yeah, well, thank you. We just had a question come through. How would you advise practitioners to navigate entitled attitudes as observed in young boys towards their parents? They're specifically thinking of a young boy who, will become a man.
Right. So that sounds like that question is around the young boy's own entitled attitudes towards
I think
towards the parent, and where they might be learning about those entitled attitudes. Yeah, I don't have the experience in working with boys that I have with men. So take what I'm about to say now with a complete grain of salt. I would be looking for the need underneath. I would be looking at how is a young boy not being seen by their mum? What we sometimes find in domestic, family, and sexual violence situations is, say that the father might be no longer on the scene. It might be post-separation after he's caused a lot of harm. That the mum who's having to climb a mountain every day, experience all sorts of impacts, and her ability to see an adolescent boy's needs, to actually understand him for who he is, might actually be a bit reduced because she's just been surviving for so many years. And so now he's 11, 12, 13, wanting a whole lot of independence, and she might not be in a great space to respond to that really effectively and understand what the boy's needs are. She might even start worrying that she's seeing a bit of the boy's behaviour, similar to what she experienced from the dad. And so it can actually mean that some boys do have the experience of feeling thwarted, and can start to become really pushy. And unfortunately, some might use violent and controlling behaviour to then start to try to assert their independence. So I guess one of the things that feels important when he has quite an entitled attitude is what are the needs that he's really expressing underneath, and obviously working with him to place limits on that, absolutely. But there can also be some work with mum as part of healing and recovery work with the surviving parent about, the really difficult situation they face, about how they respond emotionally, somatically, trauma-wise. When you've got a really big boy who's starting to take up a lot of space in the relationship, starting to make demands, starting to be very pushy about things, that can set up a whole lot of things for her, given what she's experienced from her former partner.
Yeah, thank you for that. We just have another question. When working with a family and both parents are claiming the other is the PUV, what is the best way to navigate this? And is there any way of figuring this out as the worker, noting the denial victim presentation?
Yeah, very important question because, and I will gender this because certainly in my experience in heterosexual relationships, when we are looking at someone being misidentified as a user of violence, it's very most likely the women are being misidentified as a user of violence when they're the victim survivor. I'm not saying it doesn't happen the other way around, it's much rarer. And this is often situations where she is using some self-defense and uses some physical acts of force to defend herself. Or there might be acts of dignity making. She might use some acts of one-off violence to try to punish him, but she's been experiencing coercive control from him for years and years and years, but her behaviour is more visible. And there are some men who deliberately try to create a gotcha moment, unfortunately, and do things that he knows are going to increasingly frustrate her, so that he can try to goad her into engaging in behaviour, and he then causes police. So predominant aggressor assessment is really, really important, and there's a lot of aspects to predominant aggressor assessment. What I might do is I will actually add a resource, if that's okay, Thomas, just a series of slides on predominant aggressor assessment, what we look out for to help us to get an idea of who's really afraid here. Who really has the same control and decision making in the relationship? There are little indicators like some men who've been claiming that they're the victims. Are not picking up any fear, and he's talking about her in powerful ways. It's like he's talking from a space of denigrating her, and she always does this and she always does that. But I'm not picking up impacts for him. I'm not picking up fear in his voice. I'm not picking up any hesitancy. I'm not picking up a sense of shame that that I'm in a relationship with a woman. I'm feeling afraid of her. He just seems to be acting from a space of power, just trying to tell a negative story about her, and it doesn't add up with him being victimised by her behaviour. So there's a lot of indicators, and I will share some slides that might help with that.
That would be excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I just see some hands popping up, but I was just saying that in the interest of time, if you could add your questions into the Q&A or comment section, and then we can get to them there if that's possible. Thank you. So we just had one more come through on the comments. How do you approach young people with trauma histories while still maintaining accountability? I'm wondering about a dilemma around validating trauma without colluding with the violent behaviours arising as a trauma response.
Yeah, totally. It's such a key question. And again, I'll talk about this generally and point to a couple of resources. And indeed, one of the resources is an excellent article called Safe Not Soft, which was written by actually one of the creators of the Caring Dads program, Katrina Scott, and a co-writer in Canada, that outlines this very question, or a series of practices around how we can engage with traumatic backgrounds and take a trauma and violence informed approach in a way that doesn't excuse the violence. So I think one of the things that we're often looking to do here is to the extent that it's safe and okay for the young person or the adult to start to talk about some of their traumatic reactions. Now, we don't want to necessarily open it all up. As you know, people on trauma journeys, it might just be a bit that they feel okay opening up at this point in time, a bit that they feel okay talking about, or a bit about their wobbly reactions in particular situations. So we're obviously trying to work out what's the safe bit that's okay to open up now. And then we can focus on a series of skills, which I'll fly through now, around how to create a space for him to be able to talk about how he can manage those feelings. So there's a degree of listening, and there's a degree of non-collusive listening that is important. But then we can come back to a space and we can, pivot and turn the conversation around how do you want to be able to handle those big wobbly feelings that you feel? When there's a time that you're feeling really pissed off by something that your partner does and you're shaking on the inside, what do you want to model to your children about how you'd like to respond? So we can then start to shift the conversation around the feeling being the issue, not her, or not mum if it's a boy and he's really upset about something that my parent's doing. We try to shift it to talk about the feeling. I can hear that you're feeling really wobbly, you're feeling really angry, your insides are shaking. Can we spend some time talking about what you can do when your insides are shaking? So you see, we're just trying to work towards kind of like moving away from his victim narrative that she's causing this or he's causing this towards a language that the boy or man feels comfortable talking about what's happening inside themselves. And then we can obviously do a bit of skill building around a variety of things that the boy or man can do when they're experiencing that. And yes, we do draw from DBT and ACT, absolutely. That can be really useful around that. And then once we've done that enough, we can then start to help him to reinterpret some of these situations. We can then start to help him to locate where that feeling's coming from. And it doesn't mean going and unpacking traumatic stuff which might just be not safe. But it can at the very much least going back to how much of that feeling comes from the past for you rather than what she's actually saying and doing. So we can help him to grapple with what thoughts he might be having, what thoughts he might be having about her or what she's doing, etc. And start to say, how might those thoughts get you into trouble? How might those thoughts distract you from being able to manage and respond what's happening inside of yourself? And of course, we're inviting him to reparent himself in a way. We're inviting him, in very early parts of a journey, to start to respond differently to the shame, trauma, to the hurt within himself. So that rather than making her do things to make himself feel okay, we're trying to build a part of himself that can actually see the shit happening inside of himself and that there's things that he can do to try and respond to all of that wobbliness and to build his own self-management, his own responsibility, and to get the supports he might need to do to be able to do that, to try to draw him away from blaming her. And then once he's got a little bit of skill in doing that, we can then help him to try to reinterpret these situations so that he's less hostile about her and realises that this is an invitation for him to do some caring about, himself. So there's a lot more to it than that, of course, and we all have our own different theoretical orientations, but that's just a really brief outline.
Thank you for that. That's very insightful.
Yeah, and there will be another resource I'll put in given that question. And this is about responding to, this is adults rather than young people, but responding to adults who use violence, where they've got complex trauma backgrounds. The resource is about a year old, but I'll remember to put that in as well.
No, thank you for that.
So
Also, thinking of in the interest of time, there are a few more questions, but do you want to save those to the end and just to give you enough time to do
yeah,
the second part of your presentation? Yeah.
yeah, I think so, Thomas. What I will do is there's about 4 or 5 particular resources I'll just show little bits of to try to spend some time on some of the specific skills here, and then maybe leave another 10 minutes or so for questions at the end.
That sounds excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so let's share to. Oh, I've got to get to the PDFs first. Okay. So there are now about 25 resources that will go on the site, and really apologising for overwhelming. This resource, a lot of the resources are quite brief, I'll have to say. And for example, this one, I just want to talk about risk very quickly. It's only about 4 or 5 pages, so a lot of the resources are brief. And I guess here, as we're engaging male caregivers and fathers, we are listening out for risk. And of course, in the ACT, you have domestic and family violence risk assessment and risk management framework, which does support when we're thinking about risk and doing risk assessments with victim survivors, and also too things to keep in the back of our head when we're engaging with those who cause harm. Now, I know that framework is for adults, but I guess there's some additional things here when we're looking at male caregivers and fathers who are causing harm. And when we're trying to identify, look, is there someone that we're really worried about? In a sense of, yes, he's causing harm. It's caused a lot of cumulative harm to the children and young people. It made life very difficult for his partner. There's a whole lot of impacts, yes. But this is a dad when we're really worried about him engaging in a severe act, like a domestic homicide or kidnapping the children, etc. So this resource, just briefly in the 2 or 3 pages, outlines a few of the things to look for when we're identifying really serious risk. One of that is escalation in his behaviour, and in particular qualities of escalation, which is what you can see here on this page. And I won't unpack now, I'm just really signposting and pointing to some things here. Another thing is that we're looking for grievance. We're looking for fixation. Is he really fixated on his partner or former partner where he believes that she's done something, it's taken something away from him that he's not able to restore back into his life? And that could be that sense of, I'm no longer a father. And where often when a user of violence experiences a sense of loss or a big hit to their identity as a result of their use of violence and the consequences that come as a result of that, often he'll do anything he can to get back what he thinks he's lost. And that's why, of course, separation can be an increased risk time, because he wants to get back what he's lost and will up and increase his tactics. What we worry even more if he gets to the point of feeling hopeless about it, that she won't fix what he believes she needs to fix, and he starts to cross a line in his thinking where he feels he's morally justified to actually really punish around that. And that's where the homicide timeline resource, and I've got a URL there, is really useful. So it means we're trying to think about what's changing in the family's life, what's changing in his life, and what meaning does he make out of it? What meaning is he making out of a separation, of an intervention order, of a family court ruling, etc., etc. And how obviously might depression or AOD use might also increase risk. And are we picking up any signs that he's really, really blaming her to an intense degree, fixated? And indeed, he's so fixated on her and blaming her so much for wronging him that he's doing things which is counterproductive for his own life. That sense of fixated grievance is so strong. He's not eating, he's not sleeping, he's doing desperate measures, and it's all falling back on him negatively, but he's so down that rabbit hole of grievance that he's just desperately doing what he can to try to correct what he believes is a wrong done to him. So I won't focus on this more now. There are some resources around listening out for risk, which I'll signpost in a moment. Okay, so we're just going to keep going a bit with some of the resources that you have. Oh, cool. So this is a resource around a few tips for starting the conversation, particularly if the father or male caregiver is not expecting a conversation about his use of violence. Now, many of your circumstances, when you're working with young people, there is a father still on the scene. It may well be you have a more direct lane to attempt that conversation when it's safe to do so, but it still can be really, really difficult. So won't spend time on a lot of this now, but it's a really basic resource that just works through a few simple things to help us to feel a bit more confident because we don't want to cause harm. We don't want to escalate him. And often practitioners are really worried about trying to have a courageous conversation with him because they're worried about making things worse for those who experience his violence. So this resource just runs through, as you can see, really briefly, a few steps that we can do to prepare ourselves in the conversation, how we bridge to the part of the conversation when wanting to talk about harm. I won't run through it all now, but there's some useful tips here. And part of this is how we try to create some safety to be a bit more direct with him. And there's a little resource on this. I won't unpack all of this now. You can come back to it and read it later. But part of it is trying to work out what can I bring into view with him about his behaviour that's going to be safe. And so often before a conversation with an adult user of violence, I'm thinking, what do I know about his behaviour that he doesn't know, that our service knows, that if he did know that we knew, could create risk for those who've experienced his violence because he might retaliate against them to try to shut down any future disclosures. So I'm trying to be really clear what's safe to bring in and often think about it in this way in terms of trying to create lists around what is safe. This resource has a number of other things that can be useful as well, and trying to create a lane to be a bit more direct with him about his harmful behaviour. Some of these skills you'll notice already in shame-sensitive practice in any case. Won't unpack more now. Okay, just a little more to go around the resources. Okay, 3 anchors, just need to get into. Bear with me for a moment, this is just proving a little difficult. Okay, there we go. Okay. One of your resources, it's called the 3 anchors model when engaging fathers. And I use this model a lot when I'm training intensive family support and child protection practitioners. And I know that's different to many of your situations. And I think often for statutory authorities and even family support services who don't have that statutory basis, they're wanting to hold the dad accountable because there's real harm to the children and young people who are experiencing this violence, real harm to the family. And of course, there might be emergency action that's required to try to stop that harm. But it can mean sometimes we just go in too heavy. So this 3 anchor model reminds us that when we're engaging a father or male caregiver who's causing harm, we're often trying to anchor the conversation in 3 points. Yes, the bottom lines are important. No doubt about that. We don't necessarily want to hide away from his harmful behaviour. But if we go straight to the bottom line, straight away, he's going to feel defensive, he's going to feel attacked, he's going to feel accused, he might. And you'll just feel like you're like every other service that sees him as a wife basher. And that just really shuts down the lane for the conversation. So we try to create a positive emotional space by investing a lot of the conversation in what we talked about earlier. What does it look like to be a healthy dad? What does healthy fathering look like? What does being a good dad look like? And try to build up that conversation because then we can springboard. We can then, once we've spent a fair bit of the time in the conversation looking at the positives, talk about, so John, no parent is perfect, and one of the reasons why we're involved in the service is because, we're really supporting your son through some difficult things that he's been experiencing. can we talk about what it looks like and what it looks like to your son when you're not that carefree, fun dad that you want to be? Can you tell me what he sees, what he hears, what his mother or other parent sees or hears when you're not that fun dad? So we can springboard towards the bottom lines, absolutely. But in our experience, trying to focus on the positives first can be really important to create a safe space, an engaging space. And we can hear things around values, aspirations, aspects of identity that mean something to him, what he wants to move towards, which is really important in our work, in our safety planning work with him. And then the third anchor is around him trying to understand, or trying to help him to understand, that the relationship that the child or young person has with the other parent or other parents in the family is critical, because his behaviour is obviously often undermining that, impacting that negatively. So really understanding that how he treats the other parent or other parents of his children is one of the most critical things he can do to move towards being that good dad, because often he doesn't understand that. So we're trying to build that into the conversation as well to help him to understand that. So this resource outlines this in more detail. And just as an example, I might just leave this up on the screen for a minute or two without talking, to give you a kind of sense around a bit of sequence of ways in which we try to engage dads. And I'll talk about things like the midpoint skills in a moment. Okay. Again, apologise for flying through things so quickly here. And then finally, I'm going to look at what we call the midpoint. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on this. Then I'm going to go through some of the other resources just incredibly briefly so that you know what's available for you. We talk about this a lot, the midpoint, how to try obviously not to be coercive, but also not to shame or persecute or moralise the adult user of violence, because as we'll see in the right column here, if we're too oppositional, if the conversation is too much like butting horns, he'll invest his energy in defending himself. Yes, it is her fault. Yes, no one listens to us men. He's protesting. And often when we're engaging users of violence, when they're big in victim stance, that's the story they want to tell. She did this to me. Magistrate got it all wrong. Police never listened to men. There's a conspiracy against fathers, all of that stuff. You'll hear various different variants of that. It's very hard. If we push up against that too much, it's just going to resist. What we want to do is actually draw him away from it. We want to be able to use skills that don't collude with those violence supporting beliefs. But if we attack it too directly, it's just going to double down. So we're trying to find a midpoint in the middle where we're respectful, where we invite him to look at things, where we're not trying to moralise at him, where we're listening, but we're not listening in a way that's coercive. We're not saying, "Oh, John, it's so good we're having this time together because, yeah, your partner, God, she's just so crazy. I see what you're saying. When she's saying those things to you, it must be really hard for you to manage yourself. Let's talk about what you can do in these situations when she just goes off like that." Of course, we're not going to do that. But nor at the same time are we going to say to him, "John, you've got no right to engage in that behaviour. You're just treating your kids like shit, don't you?" It's too oppositional. So we're trying to find a space in the middle. So I'm just going to run through this resource really briefly. Part of this is what we can call conversational container skills, because he's going to want to come back to that story. It's her fault, and she's doing this to me, et cetera, et cetera. And when we're trying to move him, when we're trying to turn the conversation towards what are the big feelings that comes up for him and how can he manage them, and why managing those feelings is important, how that helps him to be the dad that he wants to be, or how that helps him to fulfill his responsibilities in his community. We're obviously going to keep it contain the story. And so conversational container skills, which I'll just slowly put up on the screen here, because again, this resource you'll be able to access and get into this detail with some examples of scripts. are various micro skills we use to try to shape the conversation towards what he can do to manage big feelings, why that matters, and what are the steps that he can take towards this. And the benefits of him then accessing a men's behaviour change program or a caring dads program in order to do this work more deeply than, of course, what you would be able to do in your situation. So I won't unpack all of these now, but you'll see on the screen there's a number of micro skills here, and you would all have your own ways of being able to use these skills. You may be a lot more direct than me. A lot of these scripts here, they're a bit indirect. I'm fairly flowery in my practice. You might have much better ways of doing this than me, but hopefully the concepts will be useful as part of that. Now, as you see, fair bit here, I'll just fast forward. It does mean some listening, it does mean some empathy. So the example here down the bottom of the screen, often we're so worried about colluding. We so much want to hold them accountable, we just forget to listen. And if we don't listen to him, how can we expect him to then listen more to his young person or child or to his family members so that he can become more other-centred and understand the impacts of his behaviour on them and understand how much benefit he can produce from working towards that best dad that he wants to be and how that really matters for others. So if we don't model some listening to him, it's a bit hypocritical to then ask him to listen to his family members. But of course, we listen selectively. And we try to draw out something from what he's saying that will help us to turn the conversation towards a focus on managing feelings, towards a conversation on impacts, towards a conversation on values that matter to him, and how those harmful behaviours he's doing is not consistent with those values. So we are listening selectively, we're listening strategically. We're going down the rabbit hole of his victim stance attitudes a bit because we want to draw him out to focus on particular things to turn the conversation. And here's some examples here. We also might validate some things, as we can see as well. I don't think this is too collusive. Zero collusion is often impossible. But the listening, the humanising is really important because that then opens up a lane for us to try to shape the conversation if he does feel listened to, but trying to do it in a way that minimises collusion. And we might reframe some things. Oh, John, it sounds as though that, your partner Sally was really upset and she really wanted you to know it, rather than me echoing his language that she was hysterical, because of course that's sexist, loaded language. And as part of our attempts to turn the conversation, when she's talking about, she makes me feel this, the kids make me feel this, I lose it because she does this, what does losing it look like? What did your kids see you say or do when you get really angry? So we use open directed questions. We're doing some listening because we're wanting to isolate some feelings that he has or some language that he uses about an internal state, and then ask him, what do others see him say or do when he's feeling these things? The question infers that there's a difference between the emotion and the behaviour. These sort of open directed questions infer that just because he feels angry, jealous, doesn't mean that he has to behave in particular ways, that he has choices. And we're trying to invite him to, in very specific questioning, to focus on what others see him say or do. As you've heard me talk a lot about, we're trying to relate to values and ethics all the way along, because that's what does the work. It's the discomfort when he realises he's not that fun dad that he thinks he is, or that he's letting his family down, or whatever it is. Now, of course, shame we're always conscious of, and there are some dads that we work with who have little hope to be that best dad that they want to be. So, of course, mental health is important. Has he got any hope that he can be that better dad, or is he just spiralling into a shame spiral and hopelessness? So we're always conscious of that. And we're trying to focus on aspirations, aspects of character or values that mean something to him, and trying to help him to sit with the discomfort that the behaviours that he's willing to acknowledge at this point in time, which will only be the tip of the iceberg of his harmful behaviours, are not consistent with those values or aspirations. And so we're inviting him about whether he feels okay to do some work to help to bring his behavioural self more in line with his aspirational self, even though I know you wouldn't use that language. And part of this being in the midpoint is self-management. I've certainly worked with some men. I've just wanted to wring their neck, and that's not helpful. It's not helpful at all. And it's my own frustration. My own frustration maybe because of hearing feedback from victim survivors that day or the day before about how other men haven't changed. Or it might be, I just feel something yuck about him and he's manipulating me, he's using complex charm or emotionally abusive tactics, and I'm feeling that in my body. And so there's a lot of self-management involved. There might be other men that I feel really drawn to. Maybe we have similar political beliefs or similar tastes in music or whatever, and I like him, so I have to be careful not to collude. So that self-management, supporting each other and our teams to stay in the midpoint is really important too. Okay, just before questions, I'm just going to open up and let you know some of the other resources that you have. I'll only take a minute to do so. Let's go back. Okay. So just really quickly, one of the resources is very long. It's about a 150-page toolkit that was developed actually in the ACT, initially for child, youth and families, to support the practice of what's called the DFE, the Domestic and Family Violence Family Response and Engagement Team, which is a small team to focus particularly in child protection contexts to do some intensive work with families where fathers using violence. Won't unpack the toolkit here. You can see briefly on the screen the different aspects of it. But just to give an example, Tool 5 is about 40 or 50 pages on how to do direct safety planning with a father who's causing harm. A whole lot of, simple, skills that we can use with dads when we're trying to just start the work a bit. But Tool 1 is about assessing really serious risk when those dads that we're really worried about. I won't run through that now. Some of these resources you've seen the bottom 3, the one here on the practice model, responding to I'm the victim here, just gives some more information about how we try to draw him out of that victim stance thinking. Resource on the left is an intense poem that helps us to understand how masculinity, trauma, humiliation and entitlement all combine. It's an annotated poem, so it's actually 5 pages that runs through each of these lines of the poem and explains them. I've already looked at a couple of these resources. The one on the left gives some examples of how to try to listen non-collusively. You'll have a resource on 20 tips when we're engaging adults who use violence, when they draw upon their culture as an excuse for their use of violence. As you can see, it's just 4 pages. Each tip is brief. It just helps us when we're trying to respond genuinely and in a non-racist way to men who basically say that their behaviours are just part of their culture, which is often a smokescreen. And the middle one is a simple model, and the one on the right is about shame-sensitive practice. Again, it's just 4 pages on 20 practice tips. And then we've got a few other resources. The one on the left is when you've got a dad who's in deep pre-contemplation, how we try to open up a little bit of interest for him to talk about his behaviour when he's really in denial. Because of time, I'm just going to skip through these. The one on the right helps us to identify a bit about whether he genuinely is on a change journey. The safe, not soft I've talked about. This trauma-informed model is really helpful when we're having to have really big conversations with dads, how we go about that in a trauma-informed way. And some resources here about risk, including the one on the left, which is, again, about 6 pages of things to listen out for when we're engaging the user of violence to help us to understand risk. And then a resource from Tim Kelly in Canada on case noting and a practice technique of funneling when we need to take a very indirect approach to try to open up a lane of conversation with the person causing harm. Okay, I'll stop sharing now. And yeah, Thomas, see if there are any further questions.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for sharing those resources. There's just so much knowledge within there. I'm sure everybody will get quite a lot out of them. There's a couple of questions. So, is there greater benefit success for behavior change through group work for men or individual therapeutic sessions, or is there a combination of both?
Yeah, yeah, really interesting question. Behaviour change programs like Room for Change, for example, have been predominantly group-based. And there are real benefits of the group program, often too, because when it works well and when we can support an accountable culture, which does take time, they may actually learn good things from each other. And it means, for example, we're not just always confronting a particular man. So if a man says something in a group that's worrying, troublesome, expression of their victim stance, blaming their partner or whatever, and we don't humiliate him when he does that. We don't want to give him too much space, but we don't just necessarily need to keep talking to him about it. We can open it up to some of the other men and we can get a variety of different viewpoints, put things up on the board and invite the man to consider a range of different views here. And usually through that, we can shape a productive conversation to help him to realise what does it mean if he gives himself 100% open over to that thought that this is unfair and she's doing this and the world's against men. What happens if you just feed that and indulge in it, stew on it? We've got some other ways of looking at these situations here. What might it mean for yourself? So we've got a lot more to play with in non-shaming, non-humiliating ways when we can work it across the men. At the same time, supplementary individual work can be really important. Men are at different stages. Some men are open to some aspects of their behaviour, not others. Stuff arises for some men in the program, can be really deeply self-confronting. We might benefit by having a few more motivational interviewing sessions at the beginning. Exit planning is critical, how to help him to consolidate what he's discovered through the program. And some men, of course, need case management. Absolutely. The AOD, mental health issues, problem gambling, their own traumatic responses are so strong that they need a bit of one-to-one work to help them with some of those needs so that they can concentrate and be in an okay space to feel discomfort in the group work session. So it often is a combination of both. If it's just individual work, feminist-informed, trauma-informed work is really important. One of the difficulties, if it's just individual, is how to make sure that if we're learning things about risk, there's an integrated response. So in working with him, how's that connected to any service response to his kids and to his partner? And how can that all be connected in a way? We know I'm working with the men and men's behaviour change programs that what he says is often not verified in terms of what's really happening at home. So having that source of input and information and support, and including supporting family members to make sense of the changes he is or isn't making, because he could just come home and lie about what's happening in the group and blame her. So it's that integrated joined up approach that's really important, so that there's separate work with survivors and we're respecting privacy, of course, but the different practitioners who are working with him, supporting her, working with the children, are at least talking with each other and in the same orbit.
Yeah, thank you. We just have two more questions, but I do realise the time. Do you mind if we go a few minutes over?
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine with
If
that.
anyone
No
needs to
problems.
leave, feel free, but we'll just go a few minutes over. This question is, just thanking you for your attention to the role of shame. They're wondering what you think about working on self-love with men who use violence as one of the tools for encouraging positive change.
It's tricky because some of the men, they're already so self-focused. They're feeding in that sense of poor self-esteem. I need to love myself more. I need to look after myself really can, unfortunately, for some men, actually feed that sense of entitlement and move them even further away from other-centeredness. So it is really tricky. I think it just depends. We're assessing a number of things with a man. Is he in such a huge self-blaming, hopeless, self-derogatory mode that some self-kindness is really critically important for him then to be able to cope with understanding the impacts of his behaviours on others and to have some true self-centeredness. So yeah, sure, I think for some men, some self-kindness is really, really important step for them to actually have some kindness towards others. I probably not think about it in terms of self-love, even though therapeutically, I do understand that some of the men eventually might need to do some reparenting of themselves and might need help to be able to reparent a traumatized child, sure. But in the early and middle bits of the work, maybe focusing on things like kindness and as you go about being kind to others, what does that mean about being kind to yourself? Because yeah, I've certainly worked with some men who, as soon as they slip up, they just hit themselves over the head with this massive, oh, I knew I couldn't do it. And it's just in a home cone of shame spiral. It's not helpful. So it's a kindness that helps them to lift their head up and look around them. That's critical, rather than a self-love, which is just more navel gazing and an excuse for them to just focus on their own needs and not to focus on the needs of others.
Yeah, thank you. Just one last question. They just have a question around wondering how, as a female, how would navigating these conversations with men with a history of DFSV?
Yeah. It's definitely a gendered aspect, is important to acknowledge. In the workforce, at least 50% of practitioners are women. And obviously in men's behaviour change programs, we're trying to have mixed gender so that we can model to the men gender equality. And that doesn't necessarily always mean a male and a female gender. I'm non-binary, trans, femme. It can be different sorts of genders working together, but we're trying not to have two cisgendered men, except perhaps if it's the same-sex attracted men's behaviour change program for gay, bisexual, and queer and trans men. That would be different. So for female practitioners, there's additional emotional labour work to do. When we're more new, we're trying to find a midpoint here and trying to manage your own feelings when you've got this whole history sometimes that a number of women have of having to manage their own feelings around men and not actually expressing what they feel because they're conditioned not to express their discontent because they'll be seen as oversensitive, hysterical women. So the self-management that we have to do, there's a gendered aspect of that. For women who are used to needing to self-manage themselves to stay safe around men or who are used to in their own relationships manage men's emotions, there's an extra load there. Some women can be charmed by use of violence, might even be sexualized by him, might be discredited. It may well be in a men's behaviour change program, the men look to the male co-facilitator, but don't really look much at the female co-facilitator because they're not seeing her value as having much merit. And in behaviour change programs, we work with this, and this is why the professional development for men who do this work is absolutely critical, so that they know how they can step in and support their female colleagues without stepping in, without taking over. So there are definitely gendered aspects of this work. Women who do this work are more likely to have their own survivor histories as well too, which can be a great teacher, but it can also mean a need to self-manage, particularly when we're in a society which doesn't understand the rage the victim survivors experience or the rage that women experience because of gender equality. And victim survivors and women are told over and over again to contain that rage, which is really deeply unfair because that rage is about injustice. It's nothing personally about craziness. It's a rage of what's been done, and we need to stop that. So there are stronger emotional stakes, and I think for women who do this work, having the ability to be in solidarity with other women, women's only spaces, talk with other women who are doing this work in other organisations, get together in women's only spaces to have that solidarity to support each other can be really, really important. But certainly, I'll just end with this. some of the most effective workers with men and other adults who use violence are women practitioners, because they've got so much experience that they draw upon in safe, non-shaming ways with the men.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, well, we might wrap it up there. But yeah, thank you so much for just being so generous, with the depth of your expertise and the insights that you've brought with to us today, but also the vulnerability that you brought to this topic that asks quite a lot of anyone working within this area. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and I feel like it was exactly the kind of conversation and presentation we want for this community of practice. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Coalition, and thank you for everybody for participating.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and as mentioned, we'll send out those resources. We'll also send out a feedback survey if anyone has time to do that. It's really helpful to help inform our sessions going forward. And yeah, just before wrapping up, this is quite heavy content, so I do encourage everyone to just take a moment, step away from the screen. It's lunchtime, take a moment to yourself, get some sunlight if you can. It is raining outside here, so go look at the rain. But yeah, just check in with yourself, check in with each other if you can. Yeah, but thank you so much, Rodney. And yeah, thank you, everyone.